Good morning to you. Welcome back to Practical Stoicism. I'm your host, Tanner Campbell. As always, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Before we start, if you'd like to get rid of those ads, it's just $6 a month, and you can find out more by going to stoicism.supercast.com. If you don't want to support this podcast with money, but you'd still like to support it, you can do that by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or Podchaser.com, or by sharing it with your friends and family. Word of mouth is helpful too. However you choose to support, I appreciate it, and thanks. Today we'll be diving into Meditation 8 from Book 4 of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and that meditation reads as follows. Take away thy opinion, and then there is taken away the complaint. I have been harmed. Take away the complaint, I have been harmed, and the harm is taken away. It's not the external event that has hurt us. It is our perception or opinion of that event which has done us harm. This is hard to come around to for most people because there are some very terrible things which can happen to us that make it quite difficult to tell the victim of that the crime or whatever that thing was hasn't actually hurt them, and instead it's how they look at the thing that happened to them that's doing the real harm. Imagine telling the victim of a horrendous beating or rape or nightmarish kidnapping that the pain these things cause them are all in their minds. And, I might lose a few followers on this episode. I might get some bad reviews, but Stoicism, even my brand of it, Practical Stoicism, does hold this to be true. But it's not as black and white as you might think. One of the reasons we, as Stoics, work to develop resilient minds is that we know full well that at some point in our lives, something terrible is going to happen to us or to someone we care about. And I am going to share a very personal story with you to drive this home. When I was a young man, I would say 16 or 17, I was sexually assaulted by a much older man. I remember, as I think about it in my head now, that he was in his 70s or so. And this happened in the rec room of my mother's condominium complex, the one she lived in. She didn't own the condominium complex. The nature of this assault when compared to what it could have been was very minor. If I tried to compare sexual assault to a car wreck, this could have been a 10-car pileup on the interstate at rush hour, but instead, because I was physically strong enough, it was a fender bender in the parking lot. I was able to remove myself from the situation before anything really bad happened. And as soon as I got away, I rushed towards my mother's condo, but led on to no one that anything had happened for many years. This, in fact, may be only the third or fourth time I have mentioned it out loud, and it is certainly the most public I have ever been about it. To color that a little bit, if my mother or father heard this episode, or either of my siblings, it would be the first time they had ever heard of this happening to me. I never brought it up. Over the years, I came up with a lot of excuses for that man's behavior. He might have been senile, he might have been mentally ill, or he may have been a regular predator of adolescent boys, which is what I was at the time. And I think the only reason this didn't have more of an effect on me, because ultimately it didn't, I was able to get over it very quickly, is because it occurred precisely and immediately after I graduated high school from a military academy run by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. In that school, which I attended for 2 years, I learned to value myself, to love myself, which sounds like an odd thing to learn in a military school, but it's true. And I learned what my place was in the world and what power I did and didn't have. And to be very honest, and maybe this is the first time I'm framing it like this, the basics of Stoicism, though not identified as Stoic at the time, were probably taught to me in that school. My self-confidence, my courage, my healthy masculinity had, in retrospect, just finished being somewhat cemented when this happened. I wasn't a man yet, but I was well on my way. I had been set on a healthy path, and there would be a few departures in the years to follow, but I was on a good path. Had that not been the case, I may not have been strong enough to stop what might have happened. And I might not have been mentally resilient enough to frame this event as a singular moment that wouldn't negatively impact the rest of my life. And what may my future have looked like then? The Tanner today could be extremely timid, afraid of the world, uncomfortable around older men and strangers. I might have a high level of anxiety. Perhaps even I could have developed psychoses or a phobia. And whose fault would that have been? The answer is maybe not where you think I'm going. The answer is not my fault. I think of this experience a lot, and I don't do it to manage my resilience. At this point, I am extremely resilient. I do it to remind myself that luck exists. If I hadn't gone to military school, if I hadn't had every exact experience exactly as I had it right up to that point, that assault could have turned me into a psychological disaster for the rest of my life. My life could have been so much harder as a result of that trauma. I could have struggled to overcome that trauma for decades. But I got lucky. The timing of that terrible thing was well timed, and I'm lucky it was. Stoicism wants us to ramp up to resilience, bravery, and a love of justice as quickly as possible because its founders knew perfectly well that terrible things could damage you to such an extent that without a resilient mind, you would never be able to recover your senses. And think of the terrible things that happened back then. Perhaps a son or daughter watched their parents being murdered in a raid or a robbery. How can you prevent a young mind from breaking or having lifelong trauma after seeing such a terrible thing? How can you prevent any mind from breaking after witnessing such a thing? You can help them to become resilient and hope, too, that you can get them far enough along the path so that when these terrible things happen, and terrible things will happen in all of our lives, that we can view them as external events and we can rob them of their power to break us. And this is a difficult thing to discuss because in some ways, if you're not careful, it can sound like when a person is traumatized by an event that Stoics are blaming them for not being resilient enough. And that is not what we're doing. Once a terrible thing has happened and someone has been traumatized by it, Stoics are not the sort of people to point fingers and say, you should have been training to be a better Stoic faster. That would be incredibly cruel. Instead, we take this training so seriously because we know there's an unknown but limited amount of time to prepare you for the terrible things you will face, and there's nothing we can do for you afterwards if you're mentally unprepared when they come. So we want to practice Stoicism early, and we want to gain this ability to externalize events so we can say, it's not the event that's affecting me, it's how I feel about the event. That's why the thing that I experienced as a young man didn't traumatize me. And that's not me saying, haha, I was such a great Stoic at that point. It's me saying I was very lucky that the course of my life had gotten me to a point, very little of which had to do with me or my own choices, and more so the people around me who were trying to help me be good. If it hadn't gone exactly like that, my whole life would have been worse. I could have been permanently traumatized because of that event, or for many years at least. So we want to get into the headspace of thinking like this before terrible things happen to us so that when very terrible things happen to us, they don't break us. This has been a pretty heavy episode, but I want you to spend today thinking about it. I also want you to feel free to email me any thoughts or responses you have. I have perhaps overshared and may have over-personalized today, but I hope it was more useful than it was otherwise. So spend a little bit of time reflecting, and let me know what you think about today's meditation and my interpretation of it. I'll look forward to reading your responses, which you can send via the contact form at stoicismpod.com.